convene regular virtual gatherings. The Koplow column, published every Thursday by Policy Director Michael Koplow, remains a highly sought after source of commentary and analysis on Israeli politics and the Jewish world. Through these initiatives over the past 2 months, we reach thousands of people every week, including hundreds are being introduced to our work for the first time. But we depend on your generous support in order to keep going. So I want to encourage you to please make a contribution if you're not already doing so, particularly at this moment when Israel is poised to annex West Bank territory with the backing of the Trump administration. Your support is more important than ever. You can make a contribution at support.israelpolicyforum.org/donate. To help illuminate some of the issues surrounding annexation, particularly with regard to the United States' response to it, we are most fortunate today to be joined by Ambassador Daniel B. Shapiro. Dan is a distinguished visiting fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. Before joining INSS, he served as United States Ambassador to Israel, participating in Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, discussions on the Iran nuclear agreement, and negotiations on the $38 billion 10-year Memorandum of Understanding for U.S. military assistance to Israel. Dan was also previously Senior Director for the Middle East and North Africa at the National Security Council at the White House, and has served in numerous other senior advisory positions in the U.S. Congress. As always, we welcome your questions in today's discussion. If you're joining us via the Zoom link, you can click on Q&A to type out your questions. If you're joining by phone, please email your questions to info@ipforum.org. We'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible during the time we have today. So with that, I'm going to ask a few preliminary questions and then we'll open it up to audience questions. Dan, what do you make of Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's remark that annexation is Israel's to make? Do you see this as a commitment by the Trump administration to recognize Israeli annexation of West Bank territory, something more or less? And I realize, by the way, but before I ask this question, I think you wanted to just say a word about moving from Yom HaZikaron to Yom HaAtzmaut. So I'll let you get to that, and then you can answer my question about Pompeo.
Sure. Thank you, Susie, and thank you to Israel Policy Forum for your ongoing support of Israel and the U.S.-Israel partnership and a two-state solution. Thanks to everybody for joining. I'm in Israel, and of course, Yom HaZikaron has just concluded. As everybody probably knows, it's always a somber day, a very difficult day where Israel counts its losses and names its losses, the individual family members and soldiers and victims of terror over its entire history. And it was a particularly strange Yom HaZikaron today because families and others were not able to go to their loved ones' gravesides, not able to attend the ceremonies they are accustomed to. I usually attend the Israeli Air Force Memorial Day ceremony because of the coronavirus restrictions. So people are feeling have been feeling the sadness in their homes and sharing it online. It's an unusual way to experience something when Israelis are used to communing together to have those difficult moments, as well as the happy moments. Yom HaAtzmaut is beginning, and again, people will not be going out to parks and concerts and barbecues because of the restrictions. So the celebrations are in homes. But even as I was coming to this, I heard people singing on their merpeset. I heard people playing the beloved songs of Israel's history and history of Zionism. So despite the difficulty, and of course, despite coming out of the somber day of Yom HaZikaron, there's still much to celebrate, and Israelis are finding a way to celebrate. And I know that's very much the spirit that Israel Policy Forum also brings to its advocacy on behalf of Israel and its future. So that's a bit about today. So you mentioned the statement that Secretary of State Pompeo made earlier this week. Or maybe it was late last week. He was asked if Israel, what would be the U.S. position on Israel annexing portions of the West Bank, and he said, well, it's Israel's decision to make, and the United States, if it has views on that, will provide those to Israel privately. And of course, he's right that it is Israel's decision to make. But it's very interesting that the coalition agreement that was just recently signed between Prime Minister Netanyahu and the now Speaker of the Knesset and Chairman of Blue and White Party, Benny Gantz, actually makes it also a United States decision by stating that Israel could proceed, or the Prime Minister could bring forward a vote in the Knesset or in the cabinet on annexation after July 1st, provided he has consulted with Gantz, although it does not give Gantz a veto over it, and that he is in full agreement with the United States. So clearly there is going to need to be an Israeli-U.S. negotiation over that. If annexation will be brought forward, there needs to be agreement on it. Obviously, that means that the United States, if it so chose, could weigh in with Israel to slow that down, to limit its scope, to take into account concerns that might be raised by Palestinians, by Arab states, by others. There are those who interpreted Secretary Pompeo's second statement that the United States would share its views with Israel in private as a signal. I think there was a column in the Washington Post by Jackson Deal that suggested this, that indeed the United States does have concerns and will not lay them out publicly, but will only do so privately. I read it as a more straightforward statement and maybe providing the United States a little bit of plausible deniability that it's not really putting its thumb on the scale either way. I think the decision, frankly, was made when the Trump plan was issued, the Peace to Prosperity plan at the end of January. And while there were clearly at that time some differences between different U.S. officials on when Israel might proceed with annexing the territories that plan envisions Israel keeping permanently, there didn't seem to be difference about the fundamental question of would Israel be able to annex those territories even before negotiations had commenced. And there was a joint committee established to map exactly what territories would be defined for annexation. That committee, as far as we know, met once in the West Bank before the world sort of turned upside down with coronavirus. But I believe the administration's position was more or less established at that time. And to that extent, Secretary Pompeo's statement sounded like a restatement of that position.
Dan, how will the presidential campaign affect the Trump administration's policy on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and annexation? Will it inspire caution or invite more dramatic changes in order to please a dramatic audience?
Well, I'm going to step back and discuss for a moment a range of considerations that I think will go into the question of when and whether and to what extent annexation might occur. And the U.S. presidential campaign or the U.S. politics at the moment is one of those factors, but it's certainly not the only one. I guess I'd identify four factors. One is the realities of Israeli politics, which largely point toward annexation being more likely to happen than not. As everybody knows, there were 3 elections, basically all inconclusive, including this most recent one, which left neither Benny Gantz nor Prime Minister Netanyahu able to form a government. And at the end of, near the end of the term that Gantz had to try to form a government, he chose a unity government with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And he did so primarily, he said, because he felt that the emergency of the coronavirus pandemic and the associated economic crisis really required a unity government, really required avoiding putting Israel through a 4th election. He didn't necessarily have the ability to prevent that from happening anyway, since he didn't have full unity within his own bloc. Now, in the process, he sacrificed a lot of the leverage for the subsequent negotiations on the details of the coalition agreement, and that came forth when the prime minister made clear he wanted to have the ability to control the timing and not be subject to a veto to bring forward annexation to capitalize on the promise of the Trump plan and fulfill a promise that the prime minister made to his base throughout the political campaign that he would annex all the Israeli settlements and the Jordan Valley, kind of a tantalizing legacy for him. Now, Gantz himself is known to be somewhat, at least lukewarm on the subject of annexation. He has certainly raised concerns about unilateral steps, about doing things outside of agreements with the Palestinians, about the reaction of Jordan and its impact on Israel's peace treaty with Jordan, about broader international reaction. But he also knows there is a Knesset majority, including some members of his own party, who do support annexation. And so it's not clear that he would or even could have thrown himself in front of that train to stop it. So that's the first factor. Second factor would be the reaction of Arab states to unilateral annexation moves. There's certainly no enthusiasm among Arab states for that, and there's some strong opposition. I think the strongest is being articulated by Jordan. Jordan relinquished its own claim to the West Bank in 1988, but has never wavered from its position that what should result is a two-state solution with the West Bank, the Gaza Palestinian state. And the Jordanian foreign minister has been calling his colleagues in many European and Asian and Arab countries to try to generate opposition. There will be an Arab League summit in the next coming days that will address the question. So certainly there will be a strong Jordanian reaction. How strong and whether they would really put at risk the peace treaty with Israel, from which they, of course, also derive benefits and security cooperation. They also, it's also a reason they have such strong support from the United States, including over $1 billion of assistance annually. It's very much a question whether they would really raise it to that level of crisis, but it certainly could give pause to Israeli officials as they debate this question. More significantly, probably in Israeli thinking, would be a Saudi reaction. The Saudi government, particularly under the current Crown Prince, has made clear the Palestinian issue is not a priority. They've pursued a quiet security partnership with Israel over Iran and other matters. At the same time, they are going through their own crisis, a collapse of the oil market, as well as coronavirus challenges. And so it's possible, I can't say for sure, but it's possible they could signal that this is not a moment they need to deal with whatever question marks, instability, addressing unhappiness in their own population that might arise from unilateral annexation. But of course, people thought that might happen when the embassy was moved to Jerusalem. It didn't. And there's a lot of reasons why those Arab governments might limit themselves to rhetorical opposition, fairly mild version of it, especially if they're just more distracted by their domestic concerns at the moment, coronavirus, oil prices, whatever, if they're also concerned about maintaining a good relationship with President Trump. So it would take I think, a very strong reaction, stronger than we've seen in other cases from Arab governments, to really steer the Israeli government off of this question. It certainly would put at risk some other goals, which are a non-belligerency pact or some other form of normalization. I think the prospects for Israel to be able to achieve that with Arab states would be very much harmed by annexation going forward. But it would probably take a very strong and heavy opposition to significantly affect the thinking. The third factor is the one you mentioned, Susie, the prospect of proceeding with annexation before the US election. Now, for the diehard supporters of it, there's no time like the present. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. President Trump is the only president who's ever signaled that he could recognize Israeli annexation, unilateral annexation in the West Bank, certainly at the scale that it's being described. And of course, President Trump could lose. And so it's imperative for people who hold that view that they not wait, that they proceed immediately. And they can probably accurately say that this is not going to be a major issue in the US presidential campaign. The presidential campaign will be mostly about our own coronavirus challenges and the economic challenges. However, there are other voices in the Israeli system who will argue that rushing ahead before our election is a foolhardy thing to do. That if President Trump wins, of course, you could proceed with annexation at that point. But if Joe Biden is elected, and he has already articulated his opposition to annexation, he did so in his address to the APAC policy conference, it could lead Israel to start off on a difficult foot with the new administration, especially if that administration decides to reverse a recognition that had been offered by President Trump. I think it's a consensus position among Democrats that annexation is unwise, and it's been articulated by members of Congress as well as by all the presidential candidates. So that question hangs in the air about what what the consequence of that would be. It certainly also, one could add to it, not just Democrats, but many in the American Jewish community, including Susie, you, and the other signers of a very important letter about 3 or 4 weeks ago that articulated that many very mainstream Jewish community leaders, some of them very close to Vice President Biden, are also opponents. And this raises a very serious question for Israeli strategists who Gantz, as defense minister, Ashkenazi, as foreign minister, should be able to bring to the table to at least ask the question, is this really a smart long-term strategic play for Israel's relationship with the United States, for bipartisan support, for the security partnership, to do this right on the cusp of an American election? So that question, I think, will be debated, even if in the end, Gantz can only raise it, but not use it as a way to block it. But the fourth, in some ways, most difficult challenge, I think the supporters of annexation have to overcome in order to proceed on the timeline that's suggested, July or even later in the summer or fall, are the kind of more technical and political challenges of actually preparing and implementing annexation. There was this joint committee that was formed. It's a few officials on both sides. None of them are really the security experts. And so at some point, they will need to sit with the IDF. They will need to sit with other Israeli security officials who will have views on how easy or difficult it will be to defend rather convoluted borders that are likely to result from the annexation that's envisioned. So gaining the input of the security echelon, I think, becomes a complicating factor in that. But in a way, even more complicating is the negotiations among the advocates of annexation. There are 128 settlements in the West Bank. Some are large and parts of blocks close to the Green Line that are considered more or less consensus areas that Israel would likely keep even in a negotiated two-state solution, but others are smaller and dispersed deeper in the West Bank. And then, of course, there's the Jordan Valley strip that is envisioned. Together, it all adds up to about 30%. But as the negotiations commence between the government and the individual settlement communities, I think many of them are very likely to lobby, and they'll have strong support from influential politicians for a very expansive definition of the borders of their particular settlements. It's not just the fence line, the built-up area of the settlement, but there's a master plan, and there's another hilltop, and there are other areas that they envision as part of their settlement. In aggregate, that could swell the amount of envisioned territory well beyond 30%. And that might make it a very challenging negotiation to get the American approval that is now required in the coalition agreement to bring it up. There's some history to this. In 2004, when President Bush and Prime Minister Sharon signed an agreement, or an exchange of letters, I should say, that said Israel would not return to the 1949 armistice lines, and the expectation was that Israel would retain certain settlement blocks, those are not the words used, but that was the meaning, close to the line, and therefore the United States would not object to construction in the built-up areas of those settlements. But when the two sides tried to sit down and negotiate exactly what lines they were talking about, where the U.S. wouldn't object, they were not able to do it. Actually, the Israeli side was not even able to achieve an internal consensus to bring a proposal to the American side because of differences between the security establishment and the settlement communities about where those lines should be. So the difficulty gaining the internal Israeli consensus and then a U.S.-Israeli agreement may actually slow down this clock considerably. So I'm not a betting person. Well, sometimes I am. There's no NCAA tournament this year, unfortunately. But I wouldn't put a lot of money on any particular outcome based on all of these different pressures. Some suggesting annexation is moving very quickly, and others suggesting it's actually a lot more complicated once you get into the details. I'll just raise one last point on this, which is that when we talk about annexation or unilateral annexation outside of an agreement, it's not black and white. It's not 0 or 100. I don't mean because of the term that some Israelis use, so they say, well, it's not really annexation, it's applying Israeli law to these areas. There's no essentially legal difference between that and annexation. That's how Israel addressed the Golan Heights in 1981, and it was described as annexed, not recognized until last year by President Trump. What I mean by saying it's not black and white is that the Trump plan envisions about 30% of the West Bank, the settlements and the Jordan Valley being under Israeli sovereignty. That would definitely make a two-state solution near impossible, the way it would carve up the remaining territory, and there's no Palestinian leadership that would be able to negotiate on the basis of receiving a state on such ungovernable, non-contiguous territory. And the Jordan Valley is its own story, because it is also an Israeli consensus that the Jordan Valley should remain a security border for Israel. But there are ways it could be a security border without applying Israeli sovereignty to it, and that has been debated in Israel's history for many different approaches. And then there's the question of which settlements. If Israel decided, because of all of the factors I mentioned, that this is difficult to do, it's not the right time, it's hard to gain consensus, but they need to do something. And maybe the outcome is a down payment, if you will call it that, and annexation of just the quote unquote consensus areas, Ma'ale Adumim, Gush Etzion, some of the settlement areas that have long been envisioned to be areas Israel would keep in a two-state solution with land swaps. That's one option. Anyway, it's one option that becomes the outcome, or at least the outcome before the election, when it's theoretically easier to accommodate those measures in a subsequent negotiation. Still problematic because they're unilateral steps, but not necessarily as damaging to the long-term prospects of a two-state solution in a future negotiation with land swaps. Spoke a long time because it's a lot of detail, but I wanted to go through all those factors.
Dan, we have a lot of questions from the audience, but before I turn to them, and I will turn to them momentarily, could you talk a little bit about what would be the tolerable scope of annexation? As you know, there are different permutations. I mean, some possibilities are first just annexing the Jordan Valley, where Israel already has military control. Another possibility would be to annex Ma'ale Adumim, which is essentially a suburb of Jerusalem and would be part of Israel in any future negotiated settlement, or Ma'ale Adumim and Gush Etzion, again, major settlement block. So in your view, is there any form of annexation that might be tolerable and not set off a whole string of unintended and potentially disastrous consequences? And then the flip side of that question is there a red line? Is there a red line to annexation that frankly would blow everything up? Do you have a way of sort of calculating or quantifying how annexation could actually play out?
I mean, one of the main concerns about the way this it's suggested this would play out is the unilateral nature of it. This has long been U.S. policy, deeply supportive of Israel and its security and its Jewish and democratic character. That character is what enables us to have the deeply held common values, and that's the undergirding of the security partnership that has enjoyed bipartisan support for so many decades, and thankfully so. And so that's why keeping a two-state solution alive and viable, even in a period when the leaders don't trust each other and there's not a serious prospect of negotiations, is important. And that's why it's always been U.S. policy to discourage either side from taking unilateral measures. When I was in government, we pushed the Palestinians very hard not to unilaterally declare an independent Palestinian state, that should only be achieved through negotiations. We pushed the Palestinians very hard not to seek recognition in UN organizations or apply to the International Criminal Court for taking Israel, holding Israel accountable for the casualties and conflicts. We felt those were completely unacceptable unilateral measures on their own merits, and also because of the damage they did to the prospects for a negotiated two-state solution. And so consistent with that, it's always been U.S. policy until very recently at the Trump administration that unilateral measures like annexation that change the map again, without an agreement, aren't the kinds of things that can be recognized, and those are exactly the kinds of things that should be subject to negotiation. So partly it's less the scope and more the way this act is being described. But as I mentioned a moment ago, there are areas of the West Bank that every previous attempt to negotiate a two-state solution with a territorial compromise have envisioned would remain under Israeli control. The Bush-Sharon letters reference this, President Obama's statements about the 67 lines with mutually agreed swaps being a territorial basis, and certainly the specific proposals that Secretary Kerry worked on, all envisioned Israel retaining permanently some of these areas. And so it is, again, possible to imagine, even if it's done unilaterally, which again has a very damaging effect on the atmosphere for negotiations, it being done to an extent or in limited enough areas that there's still the room and ability for a future negotiation. The Jordan Valley was often described as Israelis to us, Israelis we negotiated with, as the security border for Israel on the east, but not necessarily an area that they envisioned or required to maintain sovereignty over in perpetuity, that there were other ways of achieving that security boundary. So this would be certainly a change if the goal and plan is to fully annex. But in a way, the most difficult part is the very sort of Swiss cheese-like map that would result from being able to annex 128 individual settlements, some of them deep in the territory that's intended for the Palestinian state, even on the limited area that it is. It's both functionally very difficult to imagine a map emerging that would make for a viable two-state solution. And it's very, very difficult to imagine a Palestinian leadership that would be able to negotiate on the basis of that plan. And so the much more likely scenario in that case is that over time, it may not happen immediately, may not happen while President Abbas is still alive or in power, but over time that Palestinian Authority becomes much less viable, that a future leadership is not able to articulate a rationale for its existence to its own people, that the security cooperation that has been so critical to saving Israeli and Palestinian lives begins to erode. And at some point, Israel may find itself needing to return to Palestinian population centers and cities in the West Bank. It hasn't been for almost 30 years, and most Israelis don't want to be. And that's where the sort of reality of a binational state becomes very, very hard to avoid, and the danger of the pressure that puts on Israel's Jewish and democratic identity, and as it has to choose between those two instead of maintaining both of them, the pressure that puts on the common values that's been the core undergirding of the U.S.-Israel relationship, and the bipartisan support for it is what worries me.
So on that point, Zach Freeman asks, how can elected officials, governors, Congress people, et cetera, support Israel and U.S.-Israel relationship without supporting or condoning annexation?
I'll just say that Vice President Biden is a perfect example of how one can do that and does that. There are many like him in the U.S. Congress. I certainly consider myself in that category as well. The U.S. and the United States support for Israel has both a strategic and a moral dimension. The strategic dimension is because we, in a very dangerous, difficult region from which many threats emanate, terrorism and weapons of mass destruction, proliferation and instability, we need partners, we need allies, we need those who share our outlook and our interest and are essentially aligned toward the same those threats the same way we are. In fact, in many cases, they're even more threatened by them than we are. And we need allies and partners who bring their own capabilities to the table to address them. And we have no better partner than Israel in the Middle East by far. Very few of even that quality anywhere in the world, who are so fully aligned with us and so fully capable of carrying their share of the load and then some, that we really have built an intimate security partnership. Our most senior military and intelligence and technology officials are in constant daily contact, sharing real-time information, training together, studying together, learning together, making both countries safer together. That's the strategic dimension of this relationship, and it's critical to U.S. interests, and it will be critical to U.S. interests. There's no scenario I can imagine where those common interests are not going to be very much present. And many of those threats, by the way, have nothing to do with the Palestinians. They have to do with Iran, they have to do with Syria, they have to do with Hezbollah, they have to do with threats that come from other parts of the region. The moral dimension is the justness of Israel's cause as a Jewish state, a homeland for a people that spent centuries in exile and suffered grievously for that statelessness. and through really a kind of an amazing miracle of the 20th century, was able to found itself and build a democracy and a homeland for the Jewish people. There's justice in that cause. There's the common values of the two democracies that have stood that have been such a critical pillar of this relationship for so long, and made it so that through changes of administration in both countries, through both political parties and on Capitol Hill and in the White House, the relationship has really only gone from strength to strength, and it's even stronger today than it was when I was in government, and it was stronger when I was in government than when the previous administration was in government, and that's just a steady upward trajectory. Again, very much in our interest, but very much reflecting our values. But it's really the values component that is the undergirding. That is what makes it possible for political leaders to year after year, decade after decade, administration after administration, Congress after Congress, know that they have the support of the bipartisan, very large majority of the American people. If those values are put, that sense of common values are put at, are called into question or put at risk, if it's much harder for even Israelis to say that this is the same Jewish and democratic state that Israel was founded to be, that was its very purpose for being created, that is really at the core of the mission of Zionism, that will also be reflected in parts of American society. When Vice President Biden spoke about this in the address, the video address he gave at APAC, he said he called on both sides, Israelis and Palestinians, to avoid unilateral measures, and he mentioned that stopping the threats of annexation it was Israel's responsibility within that dual responsibility. But he mentioned that it is something that undercuts support for Israel among younger voters of both parties. And it's really true. If you poll this question among younger Americans, Republicans, Democrats, Jewish, Christians, evangelicals, it's actually very consistent. Maybe the actual level is there's some variation, but the trend is not is very consistent. That Americans see the fact of Israel being a Jewish and democratic state as right and critical to the way they define why we are able to have this partnership. Interest will always be there, but that if there were some choice between Jewish and democratic, most Americans would say, of course, democratic. That's who we are as Americans. That's what we expect from our closest allies, our closest partners in the world, that they uphold those values. So I think that's where the risk comes in.
We have a question from Ishan Tharoor of the Washington Post. He wants to know, should Netanyahu go ahead with annexation in partial or more thorough forms? How much will it mark a point of no return for Israel's democracy and relationship with the United States? What aspects of it could be reversed?
It's hard to engage in hypotheticals to that degree, because much would depend on the scope and the map that results from any decision that's made this year. And maybe no decision is made this year. Maybe in the end it does slide past the American election. It would certainly, if it does happen this year and then there's a different administration, if that administration changes the approach that the Trump administration upholds, let's say one recognizes and the other doesn't recognize that annexation, that's another question. A third question is there still the possibility of resurrecting a negotiation, or at least finding other ways of keeping a two-state solution viable and alive for a future negotiation, even if it can't happen immediately? Again, that's very much affected by the scope of the annexation. Much harder to do that with a 30% annexation. Hard, but maybe less impossible to do that with something more limited to areas that have often been expected to remain under Israeli control. So I don't think we should speak of points of no return. I think the political leaders supported by their constituencies always have within them agency to make change, to change direction, to try new and creative approaches. And sometimes that means reversing decisions that their predecessors have made. And so I don't think anything should be treated as a point of no return. I will say this, in 1981, Israel did apply Israeli sovereignty to the Golan Heights, and it was not recognized by most countries, by any country, until just last year by the Trump administration. But that didn't prevent multiple Israeli governments in the subsequent decades, including governments led by Prime Minister Netanyahu, from negotiating with the Syrian government, when Syria was a much more stable place, about a land for peace formula that would have involved an Israeli withdrawal from most of the Golan Heights, similar to the way it withdrew from the Sinai Peninsula in its peace treaty with Egypt. And so things are possible when some decisions are made and they make things harder. That doesn't mean future decisions couldn't change direction.
Jacob Kornbluh from Jewish Insider asked if you anticipate that Biden would speak out before July 1st to caution the Israeli government against moving forward before the election in November. Is Israel making a mistake if it doesn't take the November election and prospects of a possible Democratic president into consideration just because Biden hasn't criticized them in public?
Well, I don't know what the vice president will do, and I don't speak on behalf of the campaign. I'm just here speaking on behalf of myself. I would say he has already made clear his views on unilateral annexation, as he's made clear his views on unilateral steps by the Palestinians. And so I think those views are known. Whether there will be additional things said in light of the coalition agreement is something I don't know. First of all, I think we should also say we don't know for sure that this coalition government is actually even going to come into being. Several of the changes of law that are required to bring it into being are going to be challenged before the Israeli Supreme Court next week. Even the very question of whether Prime Minister Netanyahu, while under indictment, is permitted to form a government is going to be challenged before the Supreme Court. So all of those things needed to be sorted out before we even know if this coalition agreement is going to be executed. But if so, I don't know whether there will be additional statements. But I think, as I mentioned before, if you look at his previous statements, if you look at resolutions that have been passed by the House of Representatives with near unanimous, if not almost completely unanimous support of the Democratic members of Congress, if you look at statements made by some of the most supportive members of Congress of Israel in the Democratic Party, people like Ted Deutsch and Elliot Engel and Nita Lowey and Brad Schneider, all of them have made clear on multiple occasions in the past couple of years that unilateral annexation, which makes it that much harder and potentially, depending on its scope, impossible to proceed with a two-state solution in which Israel can remain a Jewish and democratic state, is deeply damaging to American interests, deeply damaging to the future of the strong bipartisan support for this relationship. And have called on Israel not to take that, and have called on the Trump administration not to facilitate it. So obviously, if it's important, I think, for people in both countries to continue to take steps that ensure the long-term bipartisan nature of this relationship, and it's something I very much hope the Israeli government will take into account in an American election year. I think that's very appropriate.
Ari Engel says, hi, Dan. Any idea what the Gulf leaders behind the scenes are thinking on annexation, and have they signaled any repercussions Israel may face if there is annexation? Obviously, publicly, they won't support it, but any indication leaders have shifted privately?
I'm not aware of anything particularly in depth that has been articulated or communicated, and I think it's also still early. As I said, they'll also wait and see if this coalition government comes into being. And then they will, I think, judge the question of how likely it is to happen, they will certainly articulate opposition to it. I think that's clear, but these could be mild, rhetorical, box-checking statements, or these could come with additional private communication that says, wait a minute, we're really serious about this. And I think the test for them of whether it's serious very much goes to, does it create regional instability? Does it create a domestic political problem for them? It's less maybe about the Palestinians. I don't think there's a great deal of concern left in many of those countries for the Palestinians. And it may be that the answer, when they really look into it, is it doesn't have that carry that risk. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, some people thought there would be dissension and even instability, even violence over the move of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. That didn't happen. They've learned that lesson. But of course, it's a new time. There's a lot of other unstable elements going on in the region. Coronavirus, of course, the oil shock with the collapse of that market, of course, and that's not just a question for the Gulf states. The Gulf states are usually the financiers of the Jordanians and the Egyptians when their economies get into trouble. Well, their economies are in trouble because of coronavirus, but there's no money coming to them from the Gulf states, and so a Saudi or a UAE or a Kuwaiti minister might have to bear in mind what is the risk to Jordan, what is the risk to Egypt of a shock of any kind, a political shock that might produce some instability that's fueled maybe more by the economic circumstances than by the political circumstances. But sometimes those two meld, and it's hard to know exactly what the cause and what the secondary factor was. But if they aren't able to step in and help solve the economic element of that crisis, that may be something that they look at and say, this is a headache we don't need right now. If they are to communicate that to Israel, I think Israeli leaders will take it seriously and take it into account. I think it's very clear that some of the previously articulated goals, such as signing a non-belligerency pact between Israel and several of the Gulf states, would probably be out of the question in the near term if unilateral annexation takes place. And so that's something else Israeli leaders may want to take into account. How do they weight the different goals that they have regionally versus vis-a-vis the Palestinians, vis-a-vis domestic politics? It's not going to be possible to achieve all of those things all at the same time.
Bruce Levinson, hi Bruce, asks, how severely is COVID impacting Israel's economy, and to what extent, if at all, might that be part of the annexation calculation, especially if it becomes apparent that Biden is likely to become president?
Well, the COVID crisis certainly has had a dramatic impact on the Israeli economy. About 25% of Israelis are now collecting unemployment benefits, and that happened in just a very short number of weeks. The long delay in establishing a new government has delayed passing legislation and updating budgets to provide relief to people who are out of work or to small businesses that are suffering. That's one of the reasons, of course, that Gantz made the decision to go into this government. And if it's formed, I assume they will act quickly to address that. But I'm not sure there's that much of an overlap between that issue and annexation. Annexation was very much part of the Prime Minister's campaign, the last two campaigns, and certainly the most recent one following his trip to Washington for the unveiling of the Trump plan. That was well before anyone had even heard of coronavirus, or when it was really not considered to be the global pandemic that it is today. And it's of course something that Prime Minister Netanyahu's base very much is excited about, and they are standing by him or have stood by him through 3 elections, and he hopes that he will continue to stand by him through his upcoming trial on the corruption charges. So I think those would likely be largely unrelated. Although it does raise an interesting question. If the emergency that this government was established for, in fact, they have written into the coalition agreement that the only issues this government should take up in the first 6 months are coronavirus related, both health and economic outcomes of coronavirus, except for one exception, and that is Netanyahu's ability to bring up coronavirus on July 1st. But it does raise an interesting question. If this is a real emergency, and of course it is a real emergency, is that a time that it's reasonable to devote the staff time, the resources, potentially even endangering people's health to move around and travel to do the mapping that would be required to actually execute on the annexation? And there will be huge costs, of course, associated with annexation too. You'll have to really put in place border installations across hundreds of kilometers, maybe thousands of kilometers of the West Bank. That's going to be a very expensive proposition. And if Israel is tightening its belt, as every country needs to in the wake of coronavirus, that's another question that people can reasonably raise about, is this the right time to proceed with this particular initiative?
Michael Koplow was wondering, how much do you think the White House is influenced by security and technical considerations when determining the scope of annexation? How much by ideological or political considerations? In other words, is the Friedman-led annexation committee tasked with an actual bureaucratic mapping process, or is it being used as cover to implement a decision that has already been made?
You know, I don't know the answer about what the intent is. I will say that to state in very broad terms, Israel will annex or apply its sovereignty to 30% of the West Bank, Jordan Valley, with a line kind of drawn down parallel to the Jordan River, a few kilometers to the east, to the west, and the Israeli settlements, you know, with lines drawn around the known blocks and then small circles around the isolated settlements with perhaps roads connecting them. That is actually not something that can be done without really engaging technical experts. That's not something that can be done without engaging security professionals who know how you have to, where you have to be positioned to secure people's these communities and their access to the communities. It's not really something that can be done without engaging engineers, transportation and border installation engineers who would have to construct many of the facilities that would enable this annexation. So even if it is intended as a political decision that will simply be announced, its actual implementation is not possible without a very, very intense technical process. And I don't know that that's begun. I don't think it has begun. Let's say it begins, you know, in a few weeks once this government takes office. July 1st seems awfully fast to me to be able to actually do that work. I'm not sure 6 months is enough to do that work. And I don't think it's going to be easy, as I mentioned earlier, to gain a consensus among politicians, settlement residents, the IDF, some of these other professional engineering elements on what that all looks like very easily. So it's one of the reasons I think there's a lot of time between July 1st and November 3rd, and it's entirely possible that no matter what the intention is, that it wouldn't be actually practical to do anything that's other than a piece of paper announcement that doesn't actually implement anything before our election anyway.
Stuart Gershon writes, Yossi Alfer recently wrote that, quote, everything points to a binational or one state entity, unquote. Is apartheid the only possible result? Are there no examples of binational states that preserve democratic principles and minority rights?
It's a difficult circle to square. I mean, some people have cited some kind of unique arrangements in Belgium and in a couple of other places where you have kind of communities living in sort of patchwork, semi-autonomous areas. It takes an enormous amount of trust and goodwill between communities to do that. Something obviously is deeply lacking between Israelis and Palestinians with all their historical grievances against each other. Again, there's no Palestinian leadership that I can imagine coming into being in the foreseeable future that would sort of accept this very limited autonomy under overall Israeli control when the international consensus around this issue for so long has been two independent states. Even if the Palestinian state necessarily would be sovereignty compromised, it wouldn't have a military, for example. It would have to cooperate with Israel economically and in other ways. That's so. What you hear from younger Palestinians, and when I say younger, I mean pretty much anybody under 40, maybe even a bit older than that these days, is that they believe two states is pretty much a pipe dream. It's their parents' or grandparents' dream. They're very critical of their own leadership, who have, of course, kind of made it very difficult for the next generation to rise into politics, but also haven't delivered, and certainly haven't delivered on the promise of two states. And there's a great deal of corruption and other malgovernance that they have to deal with the Palestinian Authority as well. And so most of them say, you know what, if two states isn't possible, what we just really want is the rights of citizenship. And, they'd be happy to pursue those rights in a one state scenario. Again, seeing a unilateral annexation executed, I think would very much strengthen that trend. And it may be 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, but I think that a lot of countries, including a lot of the Arab states who are quite friendly to Israel, and other countries as well, certainly in Europe and in other places, would over time drift in the direction of advocating for that. They would say, you know what, if two states really isn't possible, here's an alternative where everybody can have the right to vote and representation in a parliament, one democratic state between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. That to me is something that puts Israel's the Zionist cause in great jeopardy, because Israel is a Jewish state. It must be a Jewish state to fulfill that vision, but it has always been able, with some tension, but nevertheless successfully, be both a Jewish and a democratic state with a very strong and stable Jewish minority and full civil rights for all of its non-Jewish minorities. That I think is what the risk is if those two trends of unilateral annexation and Palestinian, West Bank Palestinian anyway, interest in one state with full equal rights could lead to.
Bob Sugarman wants to know, would annexation of, for example, Ma'ale Adumim and the Gush be possible so as to keep alive a two-state outcome and avoid or minimize a problem if Vice President Biden is elected?
Well, again, those areas, broadly defined, obviously the specific lines make a difference, but those areas broadly defined have often been considered highly likely to remain under Israeli control in land swap scenarios in a negotiated two-state solution. So in terms of the impact that they could have on the map, it's a lot less damaging or problematic to future prospects. It is damaging because it's done unilaterally, but there might be ways of accommodating that or dealing with that, or reverse engineering a negotiation that arranges land swaps that take those in. That's easier to imagine, and easier to imagine a future administration that doesn't support the Trump approach, trying to find a way to work with that. So that is, when I think about what are the different scenarios, and I said it's not either black or white. There are ranges of shades of gray. That's one that doesn't make it impossible in the physical sense, as well as maybe in the political sense, to return to some sort of negotiated two-state solution. But any unilateral act is a unilateral act, and it will likely spur interest in unilateral acts on the Palestinian side. It may be hard for any administration, Trump or Biden or anyone else, to fully account for that or fully control that, or even gain much international support from Arabs or Europeans or anyone else. If the Palestinian response to Israeli unilateral action is, okay, well, we'll do our unilateral actions, they'll have a lot of support for that, even if the United States is in opposition. So it's not a path I would go down, but I do think there is a distinction certainly between a 30% annexation and the kind, Bob, that you referenced.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions, Dan. Martin Indyk, who I think wants to know if Biden should do more than just repeat that he won't recognize annexation. How about saying he will withdraw US recognition if and when he becomes president? What about saying he will withdraw protection from censure for Israel in international forums?
I think it's very likely that the campaign, or by President Biden and his campaign, will not do a lot of speculating on the various hypotheticals. I think that's pretty much a dangerous path for any presidential campaign to go down. And there's no need to do that. There's a lot of specifics about how one would respond that are very dependent on the outcome across that range and that spectrum of possibilities that might dictate a whole range of different American approaches. Making clear that he opposes annexation, certainly it would be consistent with that to say, recognition is not something that is consistent with opposition to unilateral annexation. And that will at least raise the question in the minds of the Israelis if they want to go through the process, or at least potentially go through the process of making this decision, having the President Trump recognize it, and then having a subsequent administration reverse that annexation. That will be a point of tension in our relationship. It'll be sort of costly for Israel's position and reputation regionally and internationally. And I think there are quite a number of Israeli strategists who are saying to themselves, do we really want to take that risk? Do we want to take that chance and go through that process right in the heart of an American political campaign? So it's something that I'm sure they will consider, but I don't want to speculate or offer whatever advice I'll give in public this way.
Well, thank you, Dan. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today. We had so many questions, and I really appreciate every single person who sent in a question, and we tried to get to many of them. Before we conclude, I want to encourage everyone to read the foreword that Ambassador Shapiro wrote for Israel Policy Forum's recent study, In Search of a Viable Option, by Dr. Shira Efron and Evan Gottesman on 7 potential outcomes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Dan has some very good insights there on how the US might approach different non-two-state outcomes. And that analysis now, all of them were relevant as Israel moves decisively away from that path and towards annexation. You can read Dan's forward and the rest of the report at ipf.li/news study. And I also want to take this opportunity once more to thank all of our supporters on this call. Our work depends on your generous backing, and that support is now more critical than ever as we face the immediate threat of West Bank annexation. If you enjoy our Tuesday video briefing series, the Koplo column, Israel Policy Pod, and other resources, and you've not yet made a contribution, please consider doing so by going to support.israelpolicyforum.org/donate. Please stay tuned as we announce our upcoming speakers for this series on our Israel Policy Hub website, www.israelpolicyforum.org/hub. A recording of today's program will be posted to the Israel Policy Hub website. And I hope we meet you again next Tuesday, May 5th, because if it's Tuesday, it's an IPF webinar. With that, I want to wish everyone Chag Ha'atzmaut Sameach. Thank you so much for joining us, and be well. Thank you, Dan, very, very much.
Yom Ha'atzmaut Sameach, everybody. Please make sure to celebrate 72 years of Israel's existence.
We will, with pleasure, and we welcome you back anytime, Dan. Good to see you. Thank you, everybody.